This one's for all the grandmothers who said prayers to keep us safe from the streets to the suburbs and back to the curbs. The same grandmothers who could break a fever with her whisper, some pot liquor and herbs. And to the grandfathers who broke down the knowledge and wisdom with words, but gave us an example of providing and protection while leaving their blood, sweat, and tears soaked in every square inch of the earth. Good evening. This is part 3 of my exploration of the film Sinners and the topics and symbolic nature of the project. Thank you to all for watching. And if you're new to Real Enigmas and Theories, welcome. This video will contain spoilers for the film Sinners and maybe some comparisons for others. This is one you should pull out your magnifying glasses for sure. Let's cook. Over thousands of years in time and thousands of miles on the earth during human history, powerful cultures have stolen and monetized customs from other cultures. We see this same blueprint repeat itself in today's music industry, especially within rap. Artists bite flows and ad-libs without paying homage and leaving the game saturated with copycat voices with no authenticity. And I'm gonna keep it a beanbag with you. Even content creators on platforms like YouTube or TikTok bite styles and copy vibes and thumbnail styles, and that also leads to a lack of authenticity, chasing clicks and views rather than striving for meaningful impact. Instead of learning from each other and being inspired by one another, humans have stunted their own growth with jealousy, hatred, and envy. The film Sinners touches on this in various ways, but in this installment, we're going to focus on just one. I've mentioned it briefly in parts 1 and 2, but some of the dialogue in the comments section and the misconception of some of the notions that I set forth should be made a little bit more clear. I'll start off by saying that the death of Annie in the film represents her rebellion against the perceived evil getting its hands on her knowledge and wisdom that was passed down from her grandmother. My other interpretation of her death is the stomping out of natural healing and protection information in the soul of the community. In my part 2 video, I stated how natural healers and root workers were systematically demonized yet secretly mimicked by white entrepreneurs in snake oil shows. They flipped it and bounced it and repackaged it with stimulants and drugs, then sold it back to society without acknowledging the original source, and that led to the pharmaceutical industry that we see today. Now, some viewers in the comments took those words as a reference to modern medicine, although I never stated the words modern medicine. Modern medicine is rooted in diagnostics, research, clinical study, and surgeries. I mentioned the pharmaceutical industry, which is something totally different. They are intertwined, but they're totally different. Big Pharma is a for-profit industry that develops, manufactures, and markets drugs. It's driven by shareholders, patents, profit margins, and not actually healing people. While it does produce life-saving medications, it also heavily lobbies government, inflates drug prices, and hides unfavorable research. I mean, prescriptions over cures, right? Now, when I stated that hoodoo became an amalgamation of rituals and remedies from African, indigenous, Caribbean, and multiple spiritual backgrounds of the same regions, that's correct. And during the time period of the Sinners film, the average mountebanks or snake oil salesman had evolved into very large companies that had stolen knowledge about plants, elixirs meant for healing, like Upjohn. We literally see Annie selling the little girl some Upjohn for that plantation money. Upjohn is now owned by Pfizer, by the way. Notice how the same products that Annie was selling from the shelves in her home can be seen in the child's town shop as well. Annie was entangled in the same financial trap set by the plantation owners who controlled the supply chain coming from the snake oil companies and selling watered down versions of what the elders showed them in secret. However, before they evolved, they traveled on stagecoaches to poor white communities with bogus cure-all tonics and procedures that not only made them extremely wealthy, but for the time, it created a need for consumer protection laws because people were ending up hooked on opium, ether, they were being maimed by botched procedures, or even deceased. These snake oil salesmen paid off politicians, educational organizations, and black churches to demonize natural healing. Hoodoo and root working were crackery and witchcraft. This led to the passing of laws that incarcerated those who continued to practice their American right of freedom of religion. They aligned themselves with Masonic organizations that not only had governmental influence, but controlled every aspect of entertainment, namely the circus. Snake oil presentations called medicine shows made their way into more towns by way of the circus, all while pushing out the root workers, shamans, and natural healers. They stole that style of mysticism and flamboyant presentation and turned it into a performance. And these high-powered companies still remain as most of the pharmaceutical companies that we see today. And I'm going to prove it in this video. When smoke rides into town, you can hear the song Wang Dang Doodle by Howlin' Wolf playing. The song mentions Carolyn Dye, who was actually arrested for practicing healing in her community. The Sinners film takes place in 1932. A good 12 years after a paper that was written, it reconstructed the American medical education system. Companies like the Rockefeller Standard Oil Empire, which had major financial ties to the pharmaceutical companies, backed the Flexner Report of 1910. This report, funded by the Carnegie Foundation with the Rockefellers' blessings, called for the closure of hundreds of medical schools, including nearly all black, women-led, and homeopathic schools. Natural and herbal healing, midwifery, and root work-based practices were labeled unscientific, and formal medicine became a closed club for white male, Western-trained physicians only. I have to add in here that America has come a long way from its dirty history that we once had. And as a nation, we still have work to do, but we have to be mindful about not backsliding into turmoil and use these topics to continue on a path of enrichment for everybody that's willing to work for it. Anyway, in the film, I believe that the loss of Smoke and Annie's child was symbolic of the stamping out of midwifery. This type of loss scenario was used to scare the public away from natural midwifery. Smoke even questions why Annie's hoodoo couldn't save their child. And I have to say that subliminal right there was real heavy when I thought about it. I went to see the film again for a fourth time, and being reunited with their child at the end made that notion even more clear to me. That's what they were talking about. Once companies like Bayer, Merck, and Eli Lilly established their chemical labs, they lobbied Congress and state governments to pass laws that made it illegal to prescribe, sell, or practice medicine without a license. This included root workers, midwives, and hoodoo practitioners. At the same time, these companies kept selling drug-laced tonics, morphine, and heroin legally, while traditional healers were getting fined, jailed, or run out of business for treating people with teas, oils, and prayers. They funded medical schools, research journals, and regulatory bodies like the AMA, or the American Medical Association, and the FDA. These companies created a system where only pharmaceutical-based treatments were considered legitimate. Herbalists and conjurers were excluded from insurance, hospitals, and former healthcare networks. Even today, most health insurance doesn't cover traditional practices like chiropractors, not because they're ineffective, they just know that there's not much to patent and sell. Not to mention, you might actually cure somebody and lose that lifelong clientele. Bayer marketed heroin as a cough suppressant and pain reliever for children. They were a part of IG Farben, which had direct ties to Nazi chemical warfare and the Holocaust labor camps. Now they're one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Merck sold morphine, cocaine, and opium products openly and is now a major global player in vaccines, cancer drugs, and diabetes treatment. Eli Lilly distributed cocaine tablets, morphine, and later DES, which is a hormone linked to cancers and birth defects. Now a major pharma company known for Prozac. Park Davis and Upjohn both had long histories of selling opium-based tonics, cocaine elixirs, and morphine mixtures. Today known as Pfizer, and became a household name during the pandemic, and also sells Viagra, Lipitor, and much more. Johnson & Johnson produced opiate-laced cough drops and antiseptics, and was later linked to lawsuits over talcum powder containing asbestos and the opioid crisis. And that's just a few, and they're all still here, and they're even bigger. And many have scrubbed their history clean through rebranding, merging with other companies, and shifting towards biotech. However, their foundations were laid in a market that criminalized natural healers while profiting from addictive substances. Snake oil salesmen. Now in Sinners, Annie practiced the teachings of her grandmother, and Smoke believed it enough to keep that mojo bag around his neck for all that time. The information that she acquired through those years surely contained information about various threats of a physical and spiritual nature. I've seen a couple criticisms in my comment section about the fact that Annie knew about vampires. I think they may believe that vampirism should be out of scope for a hoodoo lady in the 1930s, but on the contrary, folk tales about the undead traveled through the states as early as the 1600s. Even before Bram Stoker's Dracula dropped in 1897, people in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, they started picking up bodies and burning the hearts out of them. They thought that they were performing rituals to stop vampires from draining the life of the living. So Annie could have definitely heard stories about vampires in 1932, and her being open to different schools of thought is why she would have come across that type of information in the first place. Now, I have to say, I appreciate the film not presenting the typical Hollywood trope of demonizing cultures that are misunderstood. Hollywood has long played a role in demonizing hoodoo, voodoo, and natural healing practices by portraying them as dark, dangerous, and evil. I mean, we got all kinds of examples from like the Skeleton Key to the Princess and the Frog. Hoodoo is shown as something to be feared, misunderstood, or used for sinister powers. Rarely are these practices shown in their true light as ancestral healing systems rooted in ancient knowledge, spiritual resistance, and community care. And these portrayals help to reinforce public fear and stigma, aligning perfectly with the goals of Western medicine to sideline non-corporate healing systems. They don't want your grandmother healing your fever. That's cutting into their bag. They want you to go run down there and get some Tylenols real quick and go sit on the couch. The witch doctor trope or the voodoo doll gimmick in the swamp shaman caricature, all that played a long-standing campaign to sever the people from their roots by associating their ancestor traditions with horror and devil worship. And meanwhile, those same studios that push these narratives often receive sponsorships or ad dollars from big pharmaceutical companies. Major networks and film studios are owned by these conglomerates with direct or indirect calls to these pharmaceutical giants as well. You got Comcast, NBC Universal, and its partnerships with health insurers and drug advertisers, or you got Disney's ESPN airing commercials for Pfizer and Eli Lilly. You even get a dose directly in the show with product placements in medical dramas like Grey's Anatomy or House, and that helps to normalize the idea that only prescription drugs and hospital technology can solve illness. And it also dismisses holistic alternatives as quackery. This deliberate content pipeline ensures that audience absorb a one-sided view of health that uplifts chemical dependency and demonizes ancestral wisdom. Hollywood has become a well-lit stage where Big Pharma gets to write the script, direct the scenes, and erase the healers right out of the picture. And that's what we saw in Sinners. The truth about how the snake oil industry buried natural healing is also embedded in Hollywood's movies and TV shows just like this one. The #1 show on Apple TV at the time of this video is Severance, and it goes deep into the exploration of this history in the most subtle way that I've ever seen. I mean, they don't throw it right out there in your face, but just a little warning real quick, here's some spoilers if you haven't seen the show. The show is about a company that offers a procedure called Severance where you can get a chip put in your head and separate your work life from your home life. This show is dope and I cover it on this channel. Anyway, the company that offers this is called Lumen, and it was started in the 1800s by a man who died in 1939. So this man would be alive during the time of the Smokestack twins. The company started off as a pharmaceutical company that produced skin salves, and I always thought that salves was an anagram for the word slaves. The company also owned ether factories and had turned poor white communities into ether addicts. And remember when I said that the snake oil salesmen stole the rituals from the root workers? Get this, the workers in this company worship the founder like he was some sort of deity. They create voodoo/hoodoo style shrines for him and have herb offerings with animal parts just like African spiritual systems. They even wear all white, and this shows how the snake oil salesman stole ritual customs and adapted them to his own system of control with inside of his company. This company is involved with political figures and owns media companies as well. Now, these aspects of the show are not really surface level. These are things that I've actually revealed in my coverage of the show. Come to think about it, the publication Vanity Fair recently published an article throwing shade at the film Sinners and the director. But get this TV show Severance that I'm telling you about, their director stepped up and spoke out against the magazine's article in their headline about Sinners. So I just thought that connection was so cool that this shows are pretty much pointing out the same thing happening in the same time period. Go check out Severance if you haven't seen it, and then come back here to watch my videos about it. Now, many people look at the hoodoo in the film and associate that with anti-Christianity, when the truth is that hoodoo practitioners and Christian pastors were both pillars in the community and often shared customs until churches were incentivized to make sermons about hoodoo being the devil's work. My grandmother's mother was an herbal healer, and her father was a Christian pastor. And while I was learning up under my grandmother, she would literally tell me about stories on how this happened. And at the time, what she described to me seemed like an actual culture shock for those communities. Some say that Christianity is a white man's religion given to blacks through slavery, and that's partially true. But Christianity is originally an African spiritual system, and Africans had the Bible long before Europeans in the King James Version. However, that Bible that was most dominant in America in its spiritual practice is nothing like early Christianity in Africa. Just like the practices of the natural healers, they stole Christianity, whitewashed it, and fed it to people for subjugation. So the origins of Christianity in Africa were nothing like what we see European settlers bringing to America and what most people in America subscribe to today. Early African Christianity embraced the indigenous beliefs. An Ethiopian Christian from, say, the 4th century to the 10th century wouldn't have called it voodoo, but they would have absolutely recognized the rhythms, cosmology, and the sacred technology within it. Ethiopia didn't erase indigenous beliefs the way colonized Christianity did. Christianity in Ethiopia evolved with African cosmology, not in opposition to it. Holy springs and sacred trees still venerated, use of incense, drums, chanting, and spiritual invocation rituals, priests wearing amulets and using holy soil. Exorcism, spirit communication, and ancestor remembrance were core elements of worship in Ethiopian Orthodox worldview. They likely saw African spiritual systems not as heresy, but as older ancestral expressions of divine contact. Christianity was originally diverse and deeply tied to indigenous African spiritualities. It became a tool of colonization to suppress traditional healing, wisdom, and spirituality. And by deeming natural healing as pagan or evil, European authorities leveraged their remixed Christianity to push indigenous healing underground, the same way hoodoo practitioners face criminalization in America, erasing the power and autonomy of the original practitioners in the communities. So there it is, part 3 of my Sinners series. Some education, a little bit of history and clarification. And if you like this video, go ahead and do all that dope YouTube stuff and tap that screen for me a few times. That's all for my video this evening. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.